Hello everyone, myself Avni Gour, and today I will be talking on the book Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I will be talking about the main storyline of the book as well as doing the critical analysis of the themes in the book, which are highlighted by the author. So, about the author, Fyodor Dostoevsky was a Russian novelist and short story writer. He is famous for his novels, novellas, essays, and short stories. He he is renowned for his profound exploration of humans' complex themes, as well as his profound psychological insight over human behavior. Uh, he is regarded as one of the greatest novelists in the world by numerous critics. Like many of the Dostoevsky stories, Nose for Underground is based in St. Petersburg. Basically, the narrative is presented as a confessional monologue of a unnamed civil servant who lives in isolation. This book is divided in two parts. In first part, the narrator's philosophical introspection is described, and in the second part, some specific episodes from his past are given. So, moving forward, the first part, as I told, this section serves as a psychological treatise challenging the notion of human section, which are predicted or governed by reason alone. In the second part, we'll do transition to the narrators recounting some specific events from his past, and these events include his contemplation of a perceived side of a officer, leading him to orchestrate a petty act of revenge, and his interaction with his schoolmates, where he faces some humiliation at the dinner. So, moving forward with part one, in chapter one, the underground man introduces himself as a sick, spiteful, and uninteractive individual suffering from liver ailment, which he refuses to treat out of spite. He reflects his past as a civil servant, where he was rude to clients not out of genuine wickedness, but in a form of self-amusement. He, having retired after inheriting a modest sum, he now lives in isolation, consumed by conflicting emotions of self-loathing and intellectual arrogance. He remains in St. Petersburg despite describing its climate is worsening his health, doing it out of spite. The key themes are which are mentioned in this chapter as consciousness and inertia. The person is heightened by self-awareness, which leads to paralysis, preventing decisive actions. Masochism. He describes a perverse pleasure from his own sufferings and degradation. Uh, in this chapter sets the tone of the novel. Here, Dostoevsky introduces us to the underground man, a character who embodies contradiction and self-destructive behavior. Despite being aware of his ailment, he refuses to seek treatment, highlighting his tendency to act against his own best interest. This behavior exemplifies his complex nature, where heightened self-awareness leads to inaction and suffering. Uh, uh, the narrator here is narrator's perception and judgment are rather accepting them to face value. In chapter 2 to 4, the underground man basically tells us about his overly conscious nature, suggesting that this excessive awareness is a disease. He contrasts himself with men of action who are less introspective and thus more decisive. His acute consciousness leads him to inertia as he overanalyzes every situation to a point of inaction. He suggests the paradoxical pleasure deprived from suffering, using the example of the toothache to illustrate how one can find enjoyment in pain through self pity and elicitate sympathy from others. The themes are inaction versus action, the paralysis that tells that overthinking versus the decisiveness of less introspective individuals, pleasure in sufferings, the masochistic tendency to find satisfaction in one's own pain. Dostoevsky illustrates how excessive self awareness can lead to inaction. The protagonist, known as the unknown man, is so conscious of his thoughts and motives that he becomes paralyzed, unable to take decisions or take actions. He even admits to finding the twisted pleasure in his own sufferings. This introspective paralysis serves as a critique of the rationalist and utilitarian beliefs of Dostoevsky's time. uh, which assume that humans always act in their best interest. The novel challenges this notion by showing that people always act against their own well-being and they're driven by complex and irrational desires. In chapter 5 to 8, the underground man critiques the notion of rationality governing human behavior. He argues that humans often act against their best interest, driven by irrational desires and the need to assert free will. He challenges that the idea that civilization improves humanity, suggesting instead that it increases man's capacity for vice. The underground man posits that the unpredictability of human behavior defies the logic of rationalism. The main themes of these chapters are irrationality of human behavior and critique of rationalism. The critical analysis of this chapter says that these chapters are like a deep talk about big ideas. The underground man questions the idea that people always behave in logical, predictive ways. Dostoevsky uses him to show that real human behavior is messy, full of contradictions, and can always be explained by science or reason. He is saying that people don't always follow rules or act in ways that make sense, and that's what makes us human. In chapter 9 to 11, the underground man discusses the concept of free will, emphasizing that the desire to exercise one's own volition can lead individuals to act against their own interest. He critiques utopian societies that aim to eliminate suffering, arguing that such attempts disregard the inherent unpredictability of human nature. The underground man concludes that suffering is an essential component of consciousness and individuality. The key themes are free will versus determinism, the conflict between human autonomy and the constraints of rational systems. Value of suffering, positioning suffering as an integral part of one's personal identity and consciousness. Thus, in the critical analysis, the Dostoevsky presents the compelling argument that people have to have freedom to make their own choices, even if those choices are strange, emotional, or lead to pain. Through the underground man, he shows that humans are too complicated to be fully understood or to control. People aren't robots. They don't always do what's logical or expected, and that's okay. Moving forward in the second part, from the notes from underground, the narrative shifts from the psychological, philosophical musings to a recounting of some specific events in the underground man's life, offering a deeper exploration of his character through his interactions and experiences. In chapter 1, the underground man recalls an encounter with an officer who physically moves him aside on the street without acknowledgement. Feeling humiliated, he becomes obsessed with the incident and plots to confront the officer by deliberately bumping into him to assert his dignity. After much deliberation, he executes his plan, resulting in a minor collision that the officer barely notices. Huh. The key themes of this chapter are alienation and isolation, his feeling of being invisible and inconsequential in society, paranoia and obsession. Overthinking leads to inaction and disproportionate actions, a deep seated need to be acknowledged by others. This chapter exemplifies the underground man's internal conflict and self destructive tendencies. His fixation on the officer's slight reflects on broader struggle with societal norms in place within them. This chapter delves into the psyche of the underground man, illustrating how his introspection leads to societal paralysis and his oscillation between superiority and inferiority complex and the destructive nature of excessive self-consciousness. In chapter 2, the underground man visits his former schoolmates, Simonov, and learns of a farewell dinner planned by another acquaintance. Despite past animosities, he invites himself to the dinner, offering to contribute financially, though he lacks the means. His insistence on attending surprise the others, which who view him as an outsider. The key themes are desire for recognition. The narrator wants to be acknowledged by his friends, which he does by which is the reason for his irrational behavior, and also the power dynamics, where he attempts to reclaim his agency and undergoes a struggle perceived as the social oppression. The underground man's behavior reveals his complex psyche, torn between a disdain of societal norms his and an inherent need for human connection. His action sets the stage for inevitable conflict, illustrating his pattern of self-sabotage and paradox of seeking validation from those he professes to scorn. In chapter 3 and 4, he talks about the dinner party. Arriving late early at the dinner, the underground man endures an hour of humiliation as he waits alone. While the others arrive, they engage in the conversation that excludes him, deepens his sense of alienation. Uh, his attempts to assert himself are met with indifference or ridicule, exacerbating his internal anguish. In feeling increasingly marginalized, the man attempts to assert his presence by making provocative statements, leading to his confrontation with one of his friends and the others. His challenges are met with laughter and dismissal, culminating in his public humiliation. Despite contemplating departure, he remains driven by the masochistic desire to witness his own degradation. The key points in this chapter are the underground man's failed attempt to gain respect, escalation of conflict leading to his humiliation, his internal conflict between retreat and the compulsion to stay, deriving a perverse satisfaction from his own suffering, tells the theme of these two chapters, which is masochism. Social alienation, the protagonist's inability to connect with others leads to his self-sabotage. Uh, this these chapters illustrate the self-destructive cycle of the narrator's interactions. His provocative behavior and subsequent humiliation reflects his inner turmoil and the paradoxical pursuit of validation through conflict, emphasizing themes of pride, alienation, and the human craving for acknowledgement. Moving forward in chapter 5 and 6, he visits the brothel where he meets Lisa, a young prostitute, and experiences a complex mix of desire, pity, and yearning for connection. Uh, he wakes up at 2 a.m. in a dim lit room within a brothel, finding himself next to the young prostitute named Lisa. They engage in a conversation where he inquires about her background, learning that she is 20 years old and has been working at the establishment for 2 weeks. He recounts the story of a father deeply attached to his daughters, emphasizing the protective nature of parental love. He then paints a grim picture of the fate that waits the prostitutes, describing a recent incident where a deceased prostitute's coffin was mishandled during her funeral, symbolizing society's disregard for such women. This narrative profoundly affects Lisa, making her contemplative and sorrowful. The key points are introduction of Lisa. The key points which are introduced in this book are the introduction of Lisa, as well as um highlighting the societal neglect and the harsh realities faced by women in prostitution. These chapters delve into the complexities of human interaction, particularly between individuals from disparate society societal standings. The underground man's storytelling serves both as a means to establish a bond with Lisa and to assert his intellectual dominance. His depiction of the prostitute's funeral reflects his own cynicism and possibly projects his feelings of societal rejection onto Lisa's situation. Lisa's emotional response indicates her vulnerability and the internal conflict between her current life and the hope for a future life. In in chapter 8, 7 and 8, continuing his discourse, the underground man delivers a passionate monologue to Lisa about the grim future that awaits her if she remains in prostitution. He emphasizes that she will lose her youth, beauty, and hope, ultimately facing abuse and destitution. Lisa also listens to this intently, moved by his words, reveals a letter from a man who once proposed her, indicating her lingering hope for a different life. Uh, the underground man's monologue serves both as a after that in chapter 8, after leaving the brothel, the underground man is consumed by self-loathing and regret over his sentimental behavior with Lisa, especially giving her his headdress. He fears she might visit him, exposing his true impoverished state. To detract himself, he focuses on repaying his debt to Simonov by borrowing money from his superior. He signs the repayment along with an apologetic letter, attempting to restore his self image. The critical analysis says that the the monologue said by the underground man serves both as a sincere warning and a display of his desire to influence and control. His portrayal of marriage as salvation reflects traditional views but also raises questions about the feasibility of an escape for someone in Lisa's position. Lisa's response, particularly her mention of the past proposal, reveals her internal conflict and the complexities of her aspiration versus the reality. Also in the next chapter, the underground's man deep-seated insecurities are highlighted in his struggle with authenticity. He regrets overshowing his vulnerability to Lisa, uh, out of intimacy and exposure. The focus on repaying Simonov serves as a distraction from his internal turmoil and reflects his obsessive concern with societal judgment. This behavior illustrates the paradox of his desire for connection with his actions that perpetuate isolation. In chapter 9, Lisa, uh, the author is talking about, the narrator is talking about Lisa's visit. Lisa unexpectedly visits the underground man at his apartment, catching him off guard and causing him great embarrassment due to his modest living conditions. He becomes agitated and treats her coldly and overwhelmed by feelings of vulnerability. In and in this chapter, the main themes are empathy and redemption. Lisa's compassionate response suggests the potential for human connection to serve as a catalyst for redemption of self-awareness, as well as the power and vulnerability. The shifting dynamic between the characters shows the fluid nature of power. This chapter delves into the complexities of underground man's psyche, exposing his vulnerabilities and the paradoxical nature of his desire. His confession reveals a man torn between yearning for genuine connection and impulse to dominate, stemming from profound self doubt. Lisa's compassionate reaction serves as a stark contrast to his cynicism, embodying the potential for human kindness to penetrate even the most fortified emotional defenses. However, his inability to accept her empathy without suspicion or resentment highlights his tragic entrapment in his own psychological construct. In chapter 10, in the aftermath of his emotional outburst, the underground man becomes overwhelmed by the feeling of humiliation and perceives loss of control. He projects his self hatred onto Lisa, interpreting her compassion as pity, which he cannot tolerate. In a malicious attempt, he reasserts dominance and degrade her. He forces money into her hand, telling her as nothing more than a prostitute. Lisa silently accepts the money but leaves it on the table before departing. Realizing her noble act, the underground man is struck by a mix of shock and regret. He rushes after her in the snowy night but fails to find her. Back in his apartment, he is left to confront the depth of his isolation and the consequence of his action. The main themes are self-sabotage and isolation. The protagonist's actions to exemplify his tendency to destroy potential sources of happiness. Pride and humiliation, his inability to accept compassion without being feeling belittled. This chapter serves as a culmination of the underground man's internal conflicts and self-destructive behavior. His attempt to humiliate Lisa is a defense mechanism aimed at preserving his fragile ego in the face of genuine human connection. Lisa's dignified response, leaving the money behind, underscores her moral superiority and exposes the emptiness of cyn- cyn- cynical worldview. The final image of the underground man alone in his apartment, consumed by regret and isolation, encapsulates the tragic consequence of his inabilities to embrace vulnerability and authentic relationships. So, this ends with my summary. Thank you.